Chapter 18. That spring, I spent several weeks on end in the town of Naum. I will not disguise the fact that my interest in the man led me to neglect my duties. It was a great folly. I put off my visit to the legate Vitellius in Antioch, whom I had originally set out to see, and sent forward the message that I was ill. I pleaded that the winter climate of Jerusalem had broken down my health, and that, in order to recover it, I needed some weeks of rest in the warm valley. I cannot, until this day, explain what came over me, or what good or evil spirit imbued this man with such power to attract others, both his own, that was more comprehensible, and complete strangers, like myself. But stay I did, in order to be near him. By no means the smallest part of the folly lay in this, that my unconcealed interest in the man damaged my standing with the Jews. That distance between me and them, which the dignity of my position demanded, grew altogether too small. They came, in that peculiar way of theirs, to regard me practically as one of their own, an honor which they had already conferred on the local centurion. It is this sort of thing which one must avoid in dealing with the Jews. They are near enough a mile away. I was aware of the undignified consequences of my behavior. I even reproached myself with it. I decided more than once to leave the city immediately. But something had happened to my will, as it seemed to happen in the case of so many others who came under the man's influence. Yes, I confess that it would have been difficult at that time to distinguish me from one of his crazed followers, and of these there were enough, for it was during this period that his name stood highest. Their numbers increased not only among the poor and ignorant. Jewish scholars and men of learning flocked to him. Every day boats landed in Naum from the territory of the Tetrarch Philippus on the other side of Gennesaret, bringing the halt, the sick, and the possessed, and bringing also others whom nothing ailed, who only wished to listen to his teaching. For this much that is natural must be conceded to him, he knew how to speak. I do not know where he obtained the gift, this simple carpenter's son of Nazareth, to clothe his thoughts in such visible imagery. Of Greek education he had nothing whatsoever. He was quite devoid of the rhetoric which enables a man to express himself with precision and learning, choosing one exact short phrase after the other and stringing them together in polished discourse like pearls on a thread. His style was purely Jewish, formless, loose, and scattered, but he possessed the art of uttering himself in vivid picture parables which broke through like lightning to the minds of the simple folk to whom he always addressed himself, whatever the composition of his audiences, leaving there an unforgettable image. The art of speaking in parables by indirect and concealed expression was also a fashion with the learned Jews. It had developed among a people long familiar with alien rule and afraid to give open utterance to its thoughts, after the manner, for instance, of a free Roman. With typical Jewish cunning, they concealed their meaning in allegorical fables, by means of which they were able to convey the most subtle ideas, not in so many words, but through elusive messages. On general grounds, it would not have been at all foolish to spend a few spring weeks on the shores of the Sea of Gennesaret. Something of my reluctance to leave the place may be ascribed to the beauty of the landscape and the gentleness of the climate. It was the loveliest time of the year, in the loveliest spot in the land. After the grim monotony of the Judean landscape about Jerusalem, which withers the spirit and throws the mind back upon itself in gloomy meditation, eyes and nerves drank in with delight the idyllic restfulness and springing greenness of the Jordan Valley, of the cypresses, palms, and olive trees, the vineyards, and the long fields of wheat for which the region is justly famous. Here, where the land lies below sea level, fruit and grain ripen in advance of the other provinces. Innumerable flowers bedeck the earth. There is not a patch of soil, a stone, a house, a booth, a hedge, which is not covered with wildflowers. Their tendrils creep up the walls and twine themselves among the trellised palm twigs which screen them. The lodges in the vineyards and the gardens are set in the midst of blossoms, and blood-red poppies are scattered thickly across the fields and yards. Oleanders spring up, whether planted or not, along the paths and about the water troughs. And loveliest of all is Gennesaret itself, a blue and polished level surrounded by beds of green sprinkled with color. From afar, the snow-covered crown of the highest of their mountains looks across the scene. On such a spring day, I once heard the man preach outside the city. I learned from my friend the centurion that a certain afternoon had been set aside. It was one of their holidays, if I am not mistaken, when they pray for their trees, a minor festival, for a sermon to be delivered from a hilltop in the vicinity. My friend and I, wearing civilian togas above our armor, accompanied the crowd that left the city. The smaller hills in Palestine are molded like platforms. This particular hill cannot have been more than 40 or 50 paces from base to summit, but there was room enough on its slopes for the 200 or 300 men and women who had assembled to listen. The majority of them were his constant attendants, fishermen, fish dryers, day laborers, and city workers, but there was a higher proportion than usual of scribes and interpreters of the law. They stood apart from the common people in their own groups, distinguishable by their black garb and their headgear, the marks of their class. They, too, it appeared, had heard in advance of the sermon that was to be delivered, for they had come prepared. Some of them carried parchment scrolls and papyrus leaves, no doubt their holy books, for while they waited, they consulted texts and engaged in earnest discussion with each other. I did not know that I was about to witness an event of great importance. It was at this assembly that he set forth in systematic form, as it were, the substance of his teachings. Perhaps the scribes and scholars knew of it, which would account for their numbers and the air of preparation. They had come not only from Kfar Nahum, but from outlying towns and villages as far off as Nahum. There were present many heads of synagogues, prayer leaders, rabbis, and judges of local religious courts. They kept at a certain distance these chavarim from the common men of the earth who might contaminate them, and the latter did not dare to approach them. But the plain folk felt that this was their day, for it was their rabbi whom the learned had assembled to hear. The hill slopes, like all the fields about them, were thickly sprinkled with poppy anemones. The delicate crimson robes swayed and fluttered on their stalks against the deep background of green. On the summit of the hill was a little cluster of cypresses, and one of them lifted high beyond the others its crown of dark foliage. Swallows had filled it with nests, for the mother birds flew twittering back and forth, carrying food in their beaks for the little ones. When the crowd was all assembled, we saw the rabbi approaching from the lake shore, whither his disciples had rowed him across from Kfar Nahum. His white robe, set with fringes, gleamed against the poppy-sprinkled grass on which he trod with sandaled feet. This time he wore a black headgear. His face was earnest. With slow, almost solemn steps, he mounted the hill, greeting the scribes and scholars with their usual salutation, Shalom Aleichem, to which they answered, Aleichem Shalom. One of his disciples handed him a prayer shawl, which he drew over his head while he made the appropriate benediction. Then, taking his station under a cypress, he lifted up his arms as if to shield the whole assembly and began to preach. He spoke long and earnestly, with frequent pauses, sometimes with extreme, deliberate slowness by way of emphasis. Then the words came out of him, not as if they were sounds which could be lost in the air and be no more, but rather as if they were external images transmitted direct from mind to mind. And with what power he spoke! The frail and slender body seemed to expand until it became a mighty human pyramid, until we felt that the hill beneath him was but a pedestal. Perhaps the afternoon sunlight, deepening into the fiery red of evening, imparted an illusion of immense height and width to his figure. But his voice, too, had taken on unearthly power, for it filled all the circumambient air. On the scribes and scholars standing in their separate group, the sermon produced an extraordinary effect. Astonishment was poured out on their faces, and they lifted their arms in gestures of wonder, especially when the emphasis on certain passages seemed to deny any possibility of doubt or challenge. Very different was the reception accorded the sermon by the unlettered masses. They were prepared to accept every utterance before it issued, and they nodded their eager approval. Listening, they bowed their bodies, as if to take on their shoulders the burden of the laws which he placed on them. With blissful faces and liberated eyes, they swallowed the words and nodded confirmation. But the scribes and scholars listened with such concentrated attention that the veins stood out like swollen muscles on their high foreheads, their faces and throats, as though the blood were hardening in them. Sometimes they frowned and bit their lips. Sometimes, during a pause, they consulted hastily with each other and nodded in acquiescence. Thus it was, for instance, when he said the following: "When thou bringest thy sacrifice to the altar, and rememberest there that thy brother is angry with thee, leave the sacrifice on the altar, go make thy peace with thy brother, and then return to offer the sacrifice." After these words, he waited a little while, as if to hear an echo from the learned. They stared intently at one another, as if they were analyzing this law in silence, but soon they indicated their agreement. On other occasions they did not wait, but with powerful gestures of their heads and hands gave their approval at once. It was thus, for instance, when he said, "When thou givest charity, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth." And there were other sayings of this kind which seemed to be in harmony with their teachings, and which they accepted with indications of great respect. But there were moments when their faces showed alarm and dissatisfaction. So, for instance, when he added to the rigor of the law and increased its severity, they said to each other in distress, "He follows the school of Shammai." On another occasion I heard them say, "Now he follows the school of Hillel." These were the two schools of their tradition into which they tried to fit the laws he enunciated. When he said to them, "Love your enemies, bless those that curse you, do good to those that hate you, pray for those that persecute you." When he said this, they stretched out their hands to each other in bewilderment and despair, as if they had to go forth the very next day and fulfill the commandment. They exchanged frightened glances and said in utter confusion, "Surely it were well if it could be so, but who can carry this out? An angel, not a man of flesh and blood." And again they were seized with confusion and fright when he uttered these words, "But I say unto you, resist not evil, and if a man smite you on the right cheek, turn the left cheek to him also." They were as terrified as if they had to leave at once and put this law into immediate effect. Sometimes, however, it was not fear they showed, but a dark, cloudy resentment. In particular, they raised their brows in angry astonishment whenever he used the words, "But I say unto you," and they expressed their feeling of outrage by lifting their shoulders and turning to each other with questioning hands. But their amazement reached its extreme when he said, "You have been told that he who wishes to put away his wife shall give her a bill of divorcement. But I say unto you that he who puts away his wife except for adultery causes her to commit adultery, and he that takes to wife a divorced woman is himself an adulterer." From what passages in the sacred writings does he deduce this? The scholars asked each other violently. It is against the law of Moses, for Moses allowed divorce, and he would forbid it. Is he greater than Moses? But one of the scholars sought to defend him, beginning, Our sages too have said that when a man puts away his first wife, the altar in the temple sheds tears. True, true, we do not dispute that it is a bad thing. 40 days before the woman is born, a voice sounds through heaven saying, Daughter of such and such a one, the Lord of the world arranges marriages, and you are going down on earth to destroy them? But that which he preaches is against the law of Moses none the less.